Okay, so oh,
Yes, yes, you are online, Vincent.
okay, perfect. Then time to start. Perfect. Okay, so thank you all for joining. So this is my talk, which is about functional programming, and the title is Pseudo Keyword Functional Programming at its Finest. So thank you all for coming. I'm Vincent. I'm speaking to you right now from France. I'm in Lyon, and the weather is quite good. So let's begin the talk. So if you've seen the title, you've seen that in the title there was this term pseudo keywords. And before we start talking about pseudo keywords and explain what they are, let's just start simple and speak about regular Swift keywords. So now you can see here you can see a line of Swift code. So it's a line where we instantiate a table view. And you can see that in this line, there are two Swift keywords involved. It's the first two words at the beginning. It's lazy and var. And I want us to take a few minutes to focus on it because we'll see that while they are both in the category of keywords, they're actually quite different. So first there is var. What var lets us do, it lets us create a variable in memory. So basically var, what it does is that it reserves some space in memory. It does some other stuff, but that's the main part of var. But lazy, when we look at it, we see that it's actually very different because lazy, it encapsulates a much more complex behavior. So we can see that in keywords, they don't all have the same role. Some are very low level, like var, and some are much more high level, like lazy. But still, lazy is a Swift keyword, and as I said, it encapsulates a complex behavior. If some of you have done iOS development in Objective-C before, you might remember that when we wanted to do lazy loading, we needed to implement a specific behavior with a test to check whether or not the variable was instantiated. If it wasn't, we would instantiate it, then we would return the content of the variable. So it was some code that had to be done, and that is now encapsulated in the keyword. And we like to have this keyword in Swift because using it, it removes a lot of boilerplate that we used to have in our Objective-C code base and that we would still have in Swift if there wasn't the lazy keyword. So lazy is a good addition to the language. It makes a lot of sense to have it built into the language. However, for a developer, the lazy loading mechanism is definitely not the only useful abstraction. There are tons of other useful abstractions that we use when we write our apps. However, not all of them are part of the language, and we actually don't want them to be part of the language because if Swift were to create a new keyword for every need of every developer, the language would look like a total mess, and that's not what we want. So it's not possible for Swift to implement every useful abstraction, but how about we try to do it ourselves? How about we try to make our own keywords, so construct that we would build ourselves that would not be Swift built-in keywords, but that would behave so similarly to a real keyword that we could call them a pseudo keyword. And to build these pseudo keywords, we're first going to focus on something that I'm sure you've seen a lot when you have learned about Swift, but still we're going to go over it again because it's so important for the content of this talk, is that Swift really loves the functional paradigm. Swift fully supports the functional paradigm. And when we say that Swift is a functional language, we actually mean three things. Usually, these three things, they are summed up in this sentence: functions are first-class citizens in Swift. What it means is that in Swift, a function type is like any other type. So whenever you have a type like int or string, you can put a function there and it will still work in most cases. And there are three different ways that we can use a type. First, we can use it to type a variable. So here you see I have a variable called increment, and inside I am storing the function that takes an int and return the int plus 1. So that's the first use for a type. The second one is to is to have a type as an argument. So for instance, we are all familiar with the function map that takes a closure, and then the closure is called by map in order to transform the elements of a collection. But there is also a third one, a third place where we can use a type in Swift, and we tend to not think of it when we think of functions, but is that a function can also return a function. So here I have this function build incrementer, and you can see that its return type is a function from int to int, and what build incrementer returns is the function that takes an int and return the int plus 1. And now that we have all of this, we can start thinking about it. Because remember, in Xcode, there is this tool called refactor. Now, it doesn't always work, but when it works, what it does is that you can select some part of your code and you can extract this piece of code in a method. So it's something that we use a lot of time, and like with all of the tools that we are familiar with, we don't often take a lot of time to just think about it, but it's actually a very interesting tool because what it tells us is that any piece of code can be extracted into a function. We can always take a piece of code, wrap it into a function that takes no argument and returns void, and then call this new function. And so when we have this information, when you put that next to the fact that in Swift function types are first-class citizen, you can think that we are able to extract some parts of our code in functions, and we can also write functions that takes function as argument and return other functions. So when you put it together, you see that we can build a function that is going to be able to enhance an existing piece of code. Now, it's very possible that what I've said sounds very abstract, so we are going to immediately focus on an example in order to really understand what I mean by this idea of enhancing a piece of code. So let's look at a basic example. Let's say I want to delay an action. So maybe the user has clicked on a button and I want to do something on the UI, but I don't want it to happen immediately. Maybe I want a little delay of 1 second. So I want to implement this behavior. So to do it, I'm doing it through a function called delayed. And you can see that this function, it takes an action as an argument. So it's an escaping closure. And it also returns an action. And by action, I mean this function that takes no argument and returns void. And inside the function delayed, what's happening is that we are returning a function. And inside the function, we call the API dispatch queue main async after. So what this API does is that it's going to execute the piece of code that's in the closure action, but after a delay of 5 seconds. And now we can use this function delayed in our code. You see that now I'm building a function called hello world. And what it's going to do is that it's going to print the string hello world to the console, but it will do it after a delay of 5 seconds. So if I were to call it, I would have the side effect of printing the string to the console be executed after a delay. And the part that I really want to focus your attention on is the way that I am calling the function delayed. You can see that I'm just writing the name of the function and then a pair of curly braces and the code that I want to delay. And I can do it because Swift has a feature that is called the trailing closure syntax. And what this feature does is that when the last argument of a function is a closure, you're allowed to pass this closure outside of the regular way of passing an argument, which is between parentheses. And when you are in the special case of a function that takes a single argument, which is a closure, you can use this syntax in order to call the function without having to write an opening and a closing parentheses as we are used to doing when we are usually calling functions. So now what you can see is that I am indeed calling the function delayed, but I don't have to write any parentheses. And what's really nice with this syntax is that it looks really like if delayed was a keyword of the language. When you see it like this, it's just not colored in green. But if I were to color it in green, you might be thinking that it's actually part of Swift itself. And that's why I'm giving it this name of a pseudo keyword. It's because it's a function that we created ourselves, but at the call site, the way that we use it, it looks so much like a regular Swift keyword that we can say it's almost the same thing when you use this API. So it was the first example in order to get started, but now we are going to keep on going and to look at some increasingly useful use cases. So now we're going to look at a use case which is caching data. So let's say that I want to create a mechanism to cache the return of a pure function. So just a quick reminder of what is a pure function. A pure function is a function that for a given argument will always return the same return value and will not perform any side effect. So a good example for a pure function is all mathematical functions. The square function is a pure function because when you call it with an argument, it will always return the square of the argument and it won't perform any side effect. And this function, they have the nice property that you are able to cache the result. And once you have computed the result once, you can always return the cache result. You no longer have to perform the computation and the semantics of your program stays the same. So let's say I want to implement this caching mechanism and I want to make it in a way that at my call site, when I want to add the caching mechanism, I want it to be as seamless as possible. So of course, you can guess that given that this is the title of the talk, we are going to implement it with a pseudo keyword. So it will be a pseudo keyword called cache. So it's the function that you have on the screen. And since it's a little bit more involved than the previous one, we are going to take a look at it line by line in order to really understand what's happening. So first, let's focus on the signature of the function. You can see that it's a generic function with two generic types, A and B. So it's the input and the output. A is the input, B is the output. You can see I've added a constraint on the input is that it must be hashable, and you'll understand why later, but it's basically because we are going to use a dictionary in order to implement the cache. And then you can see that this cache function, it takes one argument. So it's a function from A to B, and it returns a function from A to B. So when you look at the signature already, the way that it works is you can quite understand it. We are going to give it a function from A to B. It will add a caching logic around it and return this new function that is still from A to B, but this time it contains a caching logic. So now, how do we implement this caching logic? So first, we declare a local variable in the function. So it's going to be our cache, and it's going to be implemented by a dictionary from A to B. Then we say we are going to return a function from A to B. So that's what we are going to do. We return a function from A to B. Next, we have to implement this function. And in order to implement it and to add the caching logic, you will see that it's actually pretty straightforward, because what we do first is that we take the input and we look in the cache to see if there is already a result stored in the cache for this input. If there is one, we return it, and that's it. We don't have anything else to do. If there was a miss in the cache, meaning if there was not already a pre-computed result in the cache, what we do is that we compute the result by calling the function f, then we store the result in the cache for future use, and then we return the result. And what you can see is that it's indeed a caching logic, because when we found a value in the cache, we didn't need to call the function f, we only called f when there was a miss in the cache. Just a quick word of caution, this doesn't work if the function f is recursive, meaning that it won't actually, it will still work, the result will be correct, but there won't be any actual caching logic implemented. But now we can use this function. So let's say we have the cosine function and we want to cache it. It might be useful, for instance, if we are working on a 2D game where we need to display some value on the screen, and when you need to display a value on the screen in a 2D game, if you've ever had to implement it, you often need to use trigonometry, and trigonometric function, they have a cost when you use them, so it might make sense to cache the result. So we want to have a cached version of the cosine, and the way that we create it is that we use the pseudo keyword cached in order to create a cached version of the cosine function. And then we can use this cached version. So here I'm using it in order to compute the cosine of 2 pi. And you can see that the first time that I use it, it takes a value that is around 50 microseconds. And then at the next call, since I already have the result of the computation in my cache, the result is computed much, much faster. And you can see that we have gained 2 orders of magnitude with this technique. But what's really nice is that often when you optimize your code, you're going to degrade its readability because you added a lot of implementation detail in order to manage the optimization. But here, the way that we've added the optimization is with a pseudo keyword, and it's a very seamless process. The quality of the code has not been decreased at all. The code is still as readable as it was before we added the caching logic. So now we're going to talk about another use case that we can find in our app when we do either UI stuff or maybe analytics stuff. It's the need to debounce something. So let's say that we have an app and we are implementing some analytics on our app, and in order to make the analytics work correctly, we want to understand how the user behaves on a scrollable screen. And this makes sense for analytics because, for instance, if you have a setting screen with a lot of options, if you see that your user is scrolling a lot, is scrolling down, then up, then down, and not clicking anywhere, it might be a good sign that your setting screen is very confusing to the user, and that you need to just rethink it. And on the other hand, if you have an app like Twitter with an infinite scroll, if you see that your user keeps scrolling and scrolling and scrolling, it probably means that the user is very engaged with the app and its content, and it's also a valuable information for analytics framework. So it's something that we want to get when we are doing analytics. So if we need to implement this in iOS, we're going to use the properties of UI scroll view, and in UI scroll view there is a value that tells you where you are in the scroll of your screen. It's a property called content offset. So it's a point that tells you where you are currently in your screen. So it's probably what we want to send to the analytics platform. But when we implement this, we're going to start thinking, but when should we actually send the value of content set to the analytics platform? Because if we implement the analytics call in the delegate method scroll view did scroll, the delegate method is going to be called every single time that we scroll, but for every single pixel of the scroll. So of course, it's going to be way too much. What we would like to do is to actually only send the analytics hit when the user has stopped scrolling for some time. And this is exactly what debouncing solves. So debouncing, if we define it, debouncing, it's waiting for a given time span to elapse before performing an action. And if any new call is made during that time frame, the timer is going to be reset. So for instance, we're going to say we want to wait for 300 milliseconds for our user to have stopped scrolling for 300 milliseconds before we make the hit to the analytics platform. And if the user starts scrolling again during this time span, we are going to reset the timer. So this way we are sure that we only send the hit when the user is no longer interacting with the UI. So it's something that's pretty common in UI code, and implementing it, usually it can get a little bit messy because it's going to involve some notion of a timer, and it's something that you need to add to the state maybe of a view controller. So it's going to degrade the readability of the view controller. And we're going to see that once again, that's something that we can implement very well with a pseudo keyword. So we are going to implement this pseudo keyword called debounced. So once again, I'm going to walk you step by step about how we can implement it. So first we start by its signature. So you can see that this time it takes not only a closure, but also a few arguments. But these arguments, they have default value in order to keep the call site as clean as possible in the most common use case. So first you see there is a delay. So it's the time span of the debouncing. Then there is the queue. It's the queue on which the action will be performed. Since we are doing something that is asynchronous, we need a queue in order to execute the code in the future. And then finally, there is the action that we are debouncing. So now, in order to implement this asynchronous mechanism, we're going to use a different part of the dispatch API. We're going to use a dispatch work item this time. And the way that it works is that it's kind of similar than the way that we've implemented the caching pseudo keyword, is that I declare a local variable work item, then I return a function. You can see that this function actually captures the work item. And what it does is that when the function is called, first it cancels the work item. So if a work item was scheduled, it's canceled. Then it's going to create a new work item that's going to execute the action. And then it's going to schedule the work item in the queue that was specified with the delay that was specified. So you can see the mechanism at work is the one that I described just before, which is of resetting the timer and starting again and waiting until no action has happened for the delay that was specified before we actually trigger the action. So I told you this time we want to send a content offset. So we don't want to debounce an action with no argument. We want to debounce an action with one argument, which is going to be the content offset. So to do it, we implement a variant of debounce. This time it's a variant that's going to debounce an action that takes one argument. So you can see that almost nothing changes. I just added the generic argument that I'm going to pass around in my closure. And besides that, the code is still the same than before. So yes, I've added it. You see, I just need to pass it around and it's still the same code. And then if I actually get to use this keyword debounced in my view controller implementation, you can see that I'm creating the did scroll handler. And the way that I create it is that I make a closure which take as the input the scroll view. Inside the closure, I get the content offset of the scroll view and I make the analytics call. And then in the delegate method, so in scroll view did scroll, what I do is that I call the handler, but since the handler has been debounced with the pseudo keyword debounce, now I have my debouncing mechanism in place. And even though the delegate method will be called for every single pixel of scroll, the actual handler, the actual action in the handler will only be triggered when the user will have stopped to interact with the scroll view for the delay, which is 300 milliseconds. And you can see that we've added it without polluting our view controller. Technically, we've still added something to the state of the view controller because this scroll handler has been added to the state of the view controller, but you can see that it's a let constant, so it's something that's not going to change. And basically, it's kind of just like if we had implemented a new method. So we've added something, but in a very seamless manner, and it's not like our view controller has been polluted by adding timers and stuff. So it's a much better way of implementing debouncing if you were to do it in the naive way of adding a timer to the state of the controller and managing the timer inside the controller. So yeah, there were some slides of focusing. Okay, so we've seen a few use cases that are already, I think, very useful. But now we are going to move on to the one use case. I think after the conference, a good part of you is gonna want to add it in your code base because you will see that it is just so useful. So we are going to keep up the good work and we're going to talk about a very, maybe like we could say, pain point in Swift, which is the way that we capture self in closures. So you are all experienced developers in Swift, so I guess you are familiar about the idea of a retain cycle. You know that if we want to avoid a retain cycle when we capture self in a closure, we need to make sure that we capture a weak version of self. And then if we want to use a non-optional self in the closure, we need to make a test. So we have what is called this weak self dance, where for every closure, we need to add weak self between brackets. Then we need to start the closure by guard let self equals self else return. And then finally, we can start writing the actual code that we want to put in the closure. And if you're a Swift developer, it's probably a code that you've been writing a lot, maybe a lot every day. And now I'm going to show you how with a pseudo keyword, you can just get rid of most of this boilerplate. So we're going to try and do it. And you'll see that it's going to be actually much simpler than what you could expect. So first, we begin by creating a protocol called Weakable. You see that there is no requirement in it. Just one constraint is that it can only implement it by a class. And it makes sense because value types, when you capture them, you cannot create a retain cycle. So the idea of capturing a weak instance of a variable only makes sense for a class type in Swift anyway. So we have this Weakable protocol. Okay. Then we make NSObject, so the root class of almost all objects in Foundation and UIKit and all Apple frameworks. We make it conform to Weakable, so we don't need to write any code in the extension itself because the only constraint is to be a class and NSObject is already a class. And then we actually start to write some code. So we make an extension on Weakable. And inside, we create this instant method, which is called Wikify. And you can see that in its signature, it takes as its input a closure from self to void, and it returns a function that takes no argument to void. So the way it is going to work is that it's going to take as its input a function where self is available as a non-optional, safely captured value that we can use, and is going to return a function that is compatible with an API that just expects a completion handler. And the way that we implement it inside is that we say, okay, so we return a function, and this function that we return, what we do inside is that we capture a weak instance of self. We are allowed to do it because we are in an instance method of a type that is weakable. So basically in an instance method of an SObject. Then we make the test in order to make sure that self is not nil. And if self is nil, we just return. And if it isn't, we call the code that we were given as an argument with this non-optional, safely retained value of self. And of course, sometimes our completion handler, they also take values and not just no arguments. So we make also a version of Wikify where we can have access to self and also an argument. And now we can use it this way. So we can just write a closure in which we say we already have the strong instance of self and then the result of that the completion handler takes as an argument. And we use the pseudo keyword Wikify in order to make it work with a completion handler that just is going to provide you the result. The function call doesn't know anything about how to deal with self. It just knows how to call a completion handler. And it just knows how to call a completion handler and give it a result. And Wikify makes this job of taking a function that expects a strong self and a result and turning it into a function that just expects a result, and in the process encapsulating this whole logic of doing weak self, guard, let self equal self, etc. So that's something that you can already integrate in your project. And I can tell you that at Worldline, that's something that we've been using for now almost something like 2 years, and we are very happy with it. At first, we were thinking, is it going to work, or is there something that we've missed? And no, it works very well. So we are very happy with it, and we find that it really removes a lot of the boilerplate that you have to write in your daily job as a Swift programmer. Now, for the last example of pseudo keywords, I want to talk about another pain point in Swift, and I want to show an example that is maybe a little bit more experimental, and you will see why I say experimental. So I want to talk about asynchronous code. So we are all familiar with the fact that first, asynchronous code is everywhere in our app. Our mobile apps, they perform a lot of network calls, and network calls, they are by nature asynchronous. And we know that asynchronous code is hard to manage in the sense that if you try to compose it naively, it leads to code that gets quickly hard to maintain and hard to understand. For instance, here I have 3 services. So the first one gets the ID of a user, then the other one uses the ID to get the username, and the third one uses the ID to get the last name. And if we want to compose them in a way that first we call the service to get the ID, then the 2 other ones to get the user data, and finally display it, the naive way to compose asynchronous code is by nesting completion handlers. And of course, it's something that scales very badly, and it's actually known in software development as callback hell, because you are nesting callbacks together, and then if you need to add a new call or switch the order of 2 calls, it becomes completely unmanageable. And if you want to manage errors, it's even worse. So developers have, of course, come up with a lot of solutions in order to manage asynchronous code. There are frameworks like Arix Swift. There are even now first-party frameworks like PromiseKit that Combine that do it. Lightweight options also like PromiseKit. But some languages, they've made a choice of managing asynchronous code directly into the language with built-in keywords. So in JavaScript, you have keywords like async and await. In Kotlin, you have sorry, in Kotlin, you have what's called coroutines, and it's function that use keywords like suspend and launch. And I want to show you that it's possible to implement the equivalent of async await in Swift using pseudo keywords. So to do it, we're going to first have to write a little bit of code that might not make sense, but when you see the big picture, you will see that it does make sense, I swear to you. So we're going to implement a function called makeSynchron, and what it's going to do is that it's going to take an asynchronous function and it will turn it into a synchronous function, so a function that blocks the thread that called it until it has returned. So you can see this function makeSynchron. It takes as an input an asynchronous function that return its return through a completion handler, and it returns makeSynchron just returns a function, a regular synchronous function, so that just returns its return value through the regular return value. And the way that we implement it is using a recursive lock. So the way that the code works, so we return a function, of course, then we create a lock, we create a local variable to store the result of the asynchronous call. Then what we do is we call the async function. And in the completion handler of the async function, what we do is that we store the result in the local variable result, and we unlock the lock. But you see that right after we've made the asynchronous code, we've also locked. So what's going to happen is that the code will run, the asynchronous code will be called, the lock will be locked, meaning that the function will block its thread, then the async call will return, the completion handler will be triggered, the lock will be unlocked, and the return of the asynchronous code will be just returned to the caller. So it might seem a little bit weird to turn an async function into a synchronous function, because if we have async function, it's because they serve a purpose, it's because they allow us to just not block our thread. So you might be thinking, what's the point? And you will see that the point is going to appear just in a few slides. I want to show you first that this makeSynchron, we take an asynchronous function and we just extract the asynchronicity out of it. So now that we have this, how can we leverage it? So I'm going to create a few helpers. First, I'm going to create a queue. It's going to be a constant that is a queue on which we can just dispatch some blocks of code. And you can see that I make it a concurrent queue. And then I'm also creating a type alias. So it will help us have function signature that will be a little bit more easy to read. So it's called completion handler. It's a generic type alias, and it's just generic type alias on the function that takes an instance of t and returns nothing. And now I'm going to start creating my pseudo keyword. So first I create this pseudo keyword await. You can see that it's going to take as its argument an asynchronous function that returns the value of type A through a completion handler, and await is going to just return the value of type A. So how can we implement it? We use makeSynchron. So we use makeSynchron to turn the body, which is an async function, into a sync function, and then we call it. So this way, await, when we call it with an async function, is going to block the thread and then return the result of the asynchronous call. Of course, like before, we make versions of await that can just deal with arguments, just like we did before. And then we implement the other part, which is async. And async, what it does is, once again, surprisingly simple. It takes a body, which is a piece of code that we are going to call. It's a piece of code that will block the thread that it's called on, because we are going to use await in this body. And what async does, it schedules the body on the async queue that I have created. So it's a queue that is not the main thread, it's a background thread. So what it does is that it takes the body and just makes it run on a background thread. And now we can use it finally. What we can do is that with async, we can create an asynchronous block of code. Inside this async block of code, we use await. And what you can see, what is really nice with await, is that it allows us to use asynchronous function just like regular synchronous function. So you can see that we now get the result of the network call just like any function call, meaning that we can affect the result of the function in a variable. And this way, if we want to compose code together, we can do it just like when we compose normal function call. So we can affect the result to a variable and then use the variable in the next call. And what's so nice is that now if we need to change the order of maybe the call to fetch user first name and the call to fetch user last name, we can just switch the two lines and that's it. The code will just compile. It will be much easier than if we needed to then change the nesting order of completion handlers. If we need to add a new call, we just need to add a line and we are not gaining a new level of nesting that makes the code hard to maintain. If we want to manage errors, we can manage them also with a much simpler flow because we could manage the error explicitly after each call. So it's really a nice way of working with asynchronous code. Once again, using pseudo keyword, this time to implement async and await. So just to take a little step back on what we did, maybe from and what we could call an algebraic point of view, what we did is that using await, we took asynchronous function and we extracted their asynchronicity, and using async, we factored it out. And in a way, you can kind of see it like when you do in algebra, when you just factor a product out of a sum. And I really like it because I think it's a very nice way of thinking about our code and just structuring our code. So that's it for pseudo keyword. That was a lot of content. If you are not familiar with functional programming, I know that this content must have been maybe challenging to follow. So it's possible that you need to come back to the slide a bit later to understand it. And it's absolutely normal. It's absolutely not a trivial content. There are some maybe a little bit like complicated points, maybe a way of coding that is not the one that we are familiar when we just make a basic iOS app. So please come back to the content in a few days if you want to, maybe if you feel that you just haven't understood it enough, you will see that once it has a time to mature in your head, you will get a better grasp on the content. We are going to do a little bit of a recap. So we've seen that in Swift, we can leverage the fact that Swift lets us use function types as any other type to build this special kind of function that allows us to enhance a piece of code. And with this technique, we've been able to create these pseudo keywords that are really great in order to reduce boilerplate, meaning to encapsulate some code that we write a lot, but that doesn't really implement a business requirement. It's just code that we need to have to make things work, but we would love to encapsulate it. And using pseudo keyword, we are able to do it and to do it in a very seamless way. Also, I haven't shown examples, but pseudo keywords, they are backed by functions. So it means that they are also highly composable. If you want to compose them together, that's totally possible. So it's something that you might maybe take a look at if you have some ideas for a use case. And maybe the key takeaway is that a pseudo keyword, it allows you to make your code more declarative and reusable. And it's two features that Swift focuses a lot on. Even API like Swift UI, they focus a lot on declarative code. So that's why I think it's such a nice addition to a code base. For me, like the Wikify, it lets us deal with Wixself in a declarative way. It's a really good addition to a code base. And finally, something that I also personally like is that it lets us take a look at our code maybe more algebraically, meaning that it lets us see that we can factor things out of our code, and maybe we wouldn't have thought about it if we hadn't been using these pseudo keywords. But since this is an iOS talk, I have one more thing for you. So I'm sure now you're all familiar with Swift 5.1 because it's been out more than a year now. And one of the main additions of Swift 5.1 was property wrappers. And if you know about property wrappers and you've been following the talk, you probably have been thinking like, yeah, these pseudo keywords, we could also implement them with a property wrapper. And yes, of course we can. And I'm going to show you an example of how it can be done to conclude this talk. So yeah, that's an example of a property wrapper. So it's this add state here that you find in Swift UI. So it's this annotation that we can create ourselves and then use in our code. So add state is a property wrapper. The property wrapper lets us decorate a property with a custom behavior, and we can still use the property like we would use it any other way. The compiler adds the call to the custom logic seamlessly, so very similar to Solo keyword. And we are going to try and implement a version of debounce that works like a property wrapper. So first we create a struct called debounced. Then in its state, we add what used to be the argument of the pseudo keyword debounce. So it's the input that we need. So the delay, the queue, and the action. Delay, queue, and action. Then we implement an init. So it's a member-wise initializer with a default value. And then we add this annotation, add property wrapper. And when we decorate our struct with this add property wrapper, it tells the compiler that this struct can be used as a property wrapper. So then we will get an error. It will tell us we need to implement something called wrapped value. So let's implement it. So wrapped value, it's a property. So here it's a computed property. And this is where we implement the logic that the compiler will be calling seamlessly for us when we use the property that is wrapped with the property wrapper. So computed property, we need to give it a getter and a setter. So the getter is pretty easy. We just return the action. And then in the setter, we actually find the exact same code than we had in the pseudo keyword. So we create this work item, and then we create the action by taking the closure that was affected, that was set on the property, and we just wrap it with the debouncing logic, which is still the same. Cancel the work item if it exists, then create a new one and schedule it with the given delay. Yeah, there is a line by line. And now we can use it. So let's say I have this struct called handler, and inside the handler, I have an action. If I want to use debounced when it's a property wrapper, I'm going to annotate the property action with the wrapper at debounced. And you can see that I can, just like with a pseudo keyword, I can give it an argument. And just like pseudo keyword, when I use the action, the custom logic is going to be called. And once again, step by step that I've completely forgot about, sorry. And when we use it, so we indeed have the debouncing logic implemented as we expect. So it's really a question of style. Personally, I like pseudo keywords a lot. Now property wrappers are here in Swift, and people are using them a lot. So it might make more sense in your code base to use one over the other. In the end, it's more of a style, maybe a code styling issue. It needs to be, I would say, you need to make choices that make sense in your whole code base. So depending on your code base, one way of doing it is better than the other. So maybe you will find that one way suits you better. Personally, I like pseudo keywords a lot. So this time the talk is really over. So just wanted to highlight the fact that there were some examples in the talk, but I'm sure that they are really only the tip of the iceberg. And I'm sure that there are a lot of use cases that you will discover in your app. When you start using pseudo keyword, you will notice that maybe this behavior, you could encapsulate it in a pseudo keyword, and you will see that it works very well and you will be very happy with it. If it happens, please let me know. I've put my Twitter handle here. I would be very happy to know about the use case you will find. Just a few useful links. So that's the link to an article. I told you at some point that the caching logic that I showed you doesn't work with recursive function. If you are curious and you want to know how to cache efficiently a recursive function, I have an article where it's explained. That's a link to a micro framework where you have the Wikify already implemented, and you have all the versions with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe up to 6 arguments. So if you want to add it to your project, you can just go there and copy and paste or integrate with Carthage or CocoaPods. And finally, that's a link of the async await. Someone implemented a complete version of async await using pseudo keywords in Swift. That's the link to the GitHub repo. So that's it. Now we're going to take a look at questions. Anyway, thanks a lot for your attention. And that's all for me.